Crown by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 17, Down the Crevasse. Daylight came long before sunrise. They had packed their rucksacks and were waiting impatiently before the first red rays finally struggled over the mountain behind them. They lit the treetops and then slanted down to the forest floor. Ellen and Otto started walking immediately and fast, for they were eager to finish the journey today if they could. After the first hour or so, the last trace of downhill slope ended. They had now definitely reached the bottom of the valley. How long it would continue flat before it started to rise again, they did not know. Ellen wished she had studied the shape of the valley more carefully when they had looked at it from the road. She had an idea that it continued level for most of the way and then arose steeply at the end, but she was not sure. Otto, who might have been reading her mind, said, "I'll climb a tree now and see where we are." They looked until they found a tree that seemed to be taller than any around it. A large beech with a trunk as wide as a door. Otto shed his rucksack, spit on his hands, rubbed them together to make them sticky, and went up like a monkey. Richard followed him, flapping around the edges of the tree, while Otto stayed near the trunk. They had played this game before. In 30 seconds, Ellen could no longer see either of them. She stood back and craned her neck, looking upward. Only an occasional faint jarring of leaves showed Otto's progress. Finally, Richard erupted from the treetop like a stone from a slingshot, and then the very highest of limbs began shaking. "What do you see?" Ellen called. "Nothing!" His voice floated faintly down through the trees. "I'm still looking!" There was more rustling at the top, and then some more again, as Otto moved around, trying to scan in every direction. Finally he called, "I'm coming down!" A few minutes later he emerged, scrambling down the trunk and landing on his feet, only a little breathless. "Could you see the pass?" "No, the tree's not high enough, but I saw one that is. It's much higher than any of the others, or else it's on a hill." "Where?" "That way." He pointed more or less in the direction they had been going, but somewhere off to the right, north. "How far? Can you climb it?" "Yes, maybe a mile." 25 minutes and several more tree climbs later, they found it. It was a huge pine, towering a third of its length over everything else around it, and it was, in fact, growing from the top of a low hillock. "I hate climbing pine trees." "Why?" "Sticky pitch." But he went up anyway. Almost at the top of the tree, there was a bare patch of trunk where all the branches had fallen away, probably struck by lightning, and in perhaps 15 minutes Ellen saw Otto reach this, clinging like a sailor to a mast, looking as tiny as a puppet. But he shouted down, "I see it! I see it!" "Which way?" "That way!" He could spare one arm briefly to point like a semaphore in the direction they had been walking. He pulled his arm back and clung there, still looking. "I see something else, too." "What?" "A line." "A what?" "I'm not sure. Wait a minute, I'm coming down." But he stayed there, staring for another minute. Then he shinnied down and disappeared into the branches. When he dropped to the base of the tree a little later, his hands were, as he had predicted, covered with brown, gluey pitch. "We're going the right way, but we're not halfway yet. At least I don't think so." He rubbed his hands in the dirt to get the pitch off, or at least to get some dirt on to make it less sticky. "What was that other thing?" "I couldn't tell exactly. Some kind of a line, almost straight across the valley. It might just be a big brook, only it's too straight. Or it might be a road I couldn't see for the trees." "How far away?" "Quite a long way, maybe halfway between here and the other end of the valley. It's time for lunch. I wish I could wash." "Go ahead, the water bottle's full." "You think it's all right?" "Only don't use too much." He used about a third of the water and some soap, but his hands were still gluey. What he needed was turpentine, or a lot of water and some sand. So Ellen peeled his hard-boiled egg for him and broke up his hardtack, and he ate them with a fork, getting the handle messy. When the sun westered again, they went on. And in mid-afternoon, about 3 o'clock, they discovered what the line was. They came on it all of a sudden. With a little bad luck, they might have fallen into it. At some time, centuries ago, the earth had split here, leaving a wide crevasse of stone across the valley. It lay across their path like a straight ditch, as wide as a room and 2 stories deep, with sheer walls of stone. Along the dark bottom, a stream flowed silently. Otto spoke in wonder. "I never saw anything like that before." "Neither did I, except in pictures of the Grand Canyon." "That's out west." "Yes, and it's a lot deeper than this. But people climb down it." "I guess so. I think they ride donkeys." "Well," Otto said, "we've got to get across it somehow." He went to the edge, peered down, lying on his stomach so he could lean his head over. "It's pretty steep," he began, "but—" "Hey!" Listen to that! His words were bouncing around his ears like ping-pong balls, echoing and re-echoing from up and down the rock walls. I don't hear anything. Ellen was standing too far back. Come up closer. You won't fall. So Ellen nerved herself and looked over the edge, too, and heard the echoes. For a while, they amused themselves by shouting, "Hey!" and counting the number of heys that came back. As many as seven if they shouted loudly enough. But then they got back to the seriousness of the problem. We've got to climb down it, Otto said, and cross the stream and climb up the other side. I think I can do it. I can see some handholds. Well, I can't, said Ellen. I know I can't. It's too steep. If only we had a rope. But we don't. I know what. What? A grapevine! They had passed many of these, great long, strong, wild cords hanging from the tops of trees, and had swung on some of them. But it was one thing to swing on a vine close to the ground, and another to descend on one into a deep crevasse with a rock bottom. Suppose it breaks? We can test it first. But even if we did get to the bottom that way, how do we get up the other side? We'll just have to walk along the bottom until we find a place where we can climb up. Finally, they worked out a plan. They would walk along the edge of the crevasse, looking in the trees for a suitable grapevine. They had seen some nearby as thick as their wrists, and that was the kind they wanted. But as they walked, they would also watch for places in the opposite wall that looked climbable. And who knows, Ellen thought hopefully, they might even find a section where the walls weren't as steep on either side. And then they could walk down. The crevasse struck across their westerly course, almost due north and south, that is, leading off to their right and to their left. Whichever way they followed it would take them out of their way, but after some study of directions, shadows and the sun, they decided that if they went north they would be making at least a little forward progress, for that way it seemed to angle slightly to the west. So they turned right, toward the distant mountains they had seen from the cliff. They found a strong and supple grapevine soon enough, and tested it for strength this way. While the vine still hung from the tree, Otto climbed up hand over hand until he was 6 feet in the air, and Ellen climbed after him until she too was off the ground, and the vine was supporting both of them at once. If it would hold their combined weights, they reasoned, surely it would be strong enough to hold them one at a time as they climbed down the crevasse. Having made sure of its strength, Otto went up the tree and cut the vine off at the top, where its small brown tendrils clung to the trunk. They coiled it like a lasso and carried it along, now to find a place where they could climb up the far side. They walked a mile, 2 miles, then 3. They had to go slowly so they could study the crevasse as they went. At about the third mile, Richard began to behave in a strange manner. Ellen noticed it first, because he had lit on her shoulder, gripping it harder than usual. Look at Richard, he's shaking all over. Otto turned. Not only was Richard trembling, but his feathers, normally sleek and shiny, were rumpled in disorder. He looks sick, poor Richard. Otto held out his hand, but Richard, instead of lighting on his finger, gave a high quavering cry and flew away. He flew hard and disappeared over the trees, back in the direction they had come from. I wonder what's wrong, Otto said. He never did that before. Could there be someone following us? No, he'd make more noise. Something's the matter with him. They went on. Richard reappeared in about 15 minutes, looking sicker than ever. He settled on Otto's shoulder, and they could hear him muttering sadly to himself, Poor Richard! Poor Richard! He stayed only a few seconds and then flew off again in the same direction as before. Either he's sick, Otto said, or there's something here he doesn't like. Or he's watching something back there. I don't think so. If he acts as if he just can't stand to stay in one place. I wonder why. I don't know. But birds feel things we don't. Something is scaring him, something in the air. Still, they had to go on. All they could do was hope that Richard would get over it. And then, at about the 5th mile, they saw something that made them forget all about him. For the moment, at least. To their enormous joy, they had found a place where the wall on the far side of the crevasse was not sheer. It was in fact a jumbled mess. A dark fissure led back into it, and great boulders lay strewn about it as if a giant had smashed it with a gargantuan sledgehammer. The boulders were jagged and rough, with plenty of hand and footholds. They formed a sort of stairway on the top, which looked, from where they stood, easily climbable. Their vine rope, looped around a big tree, knotted firmly, reached easily to the bottom of the crevasse. With feet to spare, they tied their rucksacks to it and lowered them first to be free of the extra weight. Then Otto went down, lowering himself quickly, hand over hand, as Ellen watched from above. Come on down, he shouted from the bottom. It's easy. And the echoes called out, out, easy, 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 easy. But for Ellen it was not easy. She was terrified. Don't look down! The warning came to her from something she had read long ago. Grimly she turned around and crawled herself backwards until her feet, then her legs, then her waist were over the edge. She gripped the vine. If it were only 4 feet down, she told herself, you'd think nothing of it. Pretend it's only 4 feet. And her head disappeared over the side. The vine scored her hands. The stone wall inched up past her eyes. She tried to get her feet around the vine as Otto had done, but they could not find it, and she dared not look. Halfway down. Was she halfway? Her arms began to ache furiously. A little farther, and her knee banged hard against a sharp point of stone. She kicked instinctively away from it and began to sway. Her hands slipped, and she slid, slithered, and fell the rest of the way. She was sitting on the bottom, and Otto was beside her. You made it! You're all right! But she was not all right. The fall had not been much, only a few feet, but when she landed, her weak ankle had wrenched hideously under her. She sat clasping it with both hands. She turned very pale. I've got to be sick, she said, and was.